Last week, Riot announced this.
Changes to Phoenix, Sage, Cypher, and Gecko. There might be some other fun things in store for patch 9.10, but we'll update you on that more later.
So today I thought we'd take a look at these 4 agents and decide how is Riot going to try and change these agents for the better. Let's start off with kind of the first main point here, which is that I think it's pretty obvious to me that this is kind of a 2-and-2 situation where I reckon that these 2 on the right are probably going to get nerfed and these 2 on the left are probably going to get buffed. So let's start with the buffs and talk about Phoenix. And Phoenix is a very difficult agent when it comes to buffing because Phoenix is in a very unique position in the game where there are a lot of agents who have a similar agent to them, right? Like Sage and Deadlock or Silver Fade, for example. But those similar agents tend to be within the same class. Phoenix is kind of the only agent who has a similar agent outside of his own class, where Phoenix and KO are sharing a lot of similarities. They both have a flash, they both have a molly, they both have an ult where you can essentially have a second life if things go right for KO. And so that brings up the obvious point that if we're going to buff Phoenix, in my opinion, it probably needs to be something that differentiates Phoenix from KO. And of course, that means probably focusing on the one ability that they don't share, which is Phoenix's Blaze Wall. Now, the Blaze Wall is probably one of the worst abilities in all of Valorant, but a lot of people, when discussing buffing Phoenix, they'll come up with ideas about improving his healing, which I don't think is a good idea because it would help in ranked, but Phoenix doesn't really need the help in ranked. He needs the help at kind of higher level play, and healing in higher level play just isn't as impactful. Or they might add in certain things which maybe aren't duelist enough. I know one suggestion a lot of people had is to have the Blaze Wall go through walls, and whilst I do think that would be, you know, definitely a help, maybe Riot thinks that that's not selfish enough, maybe think that's too team player for a duelist agent. But I do still think there are things you can do with the Blaze Wall which would certainly help Phoenix actually quite a lot without kind of changing too much about the agent overall. And that is simply giving the Blaze Wall something like vulnerable. Giving the Blaze Wall vulnerable would be great for a couple reasons. First of all, it's kind of thematic. It sticks with the theme, right? If you get burnt by something, you're more likely to take more injuries. Therefore, having the Blaze Wall be vulnerable is a pretty decent thematic solution. It's also a pretty major buff because right now, if you put up a Blaze Wall and a choke point as a defender, your opponent isn't that disincentivized from running through it, right? Yeah, sure, you take a tiny bit of damage, but it is only going to be a tiny bit of damage. However, if you have to go through it and you take vulnerable as well, and now you're taking double damage, that's not going to be very fun. And that means that people will respect a Blaze Wall. If you did put it up in a choke point, people aren't going to be running through it, which high level play really makes a big impact, but also even in ranked games is gonna be pretty substantial. And if you really wanted to go pretty far with Phoenix, you could also add this to the molly as well. You'd probably need to change the damage because it would melt people with vulnerable as well, but you could give the molly vulnerable as well and therefore kind of create a bit of a differentiation between, for instance, a KO molly and a Phoenix molly. Now let's move on to Sage, and I've already made a video about Sage talking about how I want to see the slow orb kind of become the default option for the signature ability. I think that that would be a really good solution to fixing Sage, but considering they aren't changing Deadlock, and I would assume that they would change both of them together in that sense, I doubt that that's going to happen. So let's talk about what's likely to happen then for Sage. And Sage here has a kind of similar position in the game to Phoenix, where in ranked, Sage is a decent option, fine to play in ranked. But in pro play or high level play, not so good. So when it comes to Sage, if you're not going for some kind of big rework of where the abilities are, it's going to be tough. I know a lot of people again will just say, hey, improve the healing to how it was before, let me self heal, all of that kind of stuff. But again, this would be really good for ranked, but again, in pro play, probably not that important. So what other things could we do to help improve Sage in the areas that she actually needs improving? Well, one thing I think is the ult. Because the ult, especially in pro play, I think as the years have gone on, has gotten worse and worse. I remember when I was first getting into pro play, you know, there was little interviews with players asking, you know, what do you think the best ult in the game is? And they pretty much all said the Sage ult. Now, if you ask pro players what the best ult is, literally none of them would say the Sage ult. Because pro teams have become really good at playing around Sage ults. They're ready for it, they know when it's coming, and you know, they create traps essentially for when are you gonna res. We can kill the guy that you've resed and maybe even kill even more people who are kind of around in that area. And the way I think you can fix the Sage res is just by quickening up the animation of how long it takes to res someone. This would obviously give your opponents less time to kind of react. If they weren't to do that though, and were to focus on other areas for Sage, you'd probably just be looking at like extending the time of a slow orb or something like that. I doubt you would see anything too flashy other than, you know, just a couple number tweaks of making the wall harder to kill, or having the slow orbs last longer, etc. Okay, so that was the buffs. Now let's talk about the nerfs, and our first agent here is Cypher. So in this past season, of course, Cypher got a pretty significant buff at the start of the season with the rearm of the trips, and I think that that was really the thing that propelled Cypher to become a pretty strong agent across most of the maps. They then did tweak this slightly and made the rearm time a bit longer than it was to slightly nerf Cypher, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did this again. I think that when you're looking at nerfing an agent, you have to identify like what is the actual problem with the agent, what's the thing that's causing, you know, too many problems, and I think for Cypher it is the rearm time of the trips. Now I personally like the rearm time. I like that, you know, your Cypher trips aren't getting destroyed by Skydogs and Fade Prowlers and like that, and, you know, you just lose them for the entire round. I think it's good that that isn't the case, but I still think that perhaps a slightly longer rearm time again would just help mitigate some of that strength, so that, you know, when you are going for an exec, there's a bit more of a grace period of whatever first hits that trip, be it, you know, a Skydog or a Euroclone or whatever, you know, that your team does still have enough time to then, you know, get past that trip as a team. You know, if there's a lot of other things going on, you're not getting caught out by it. But one thing that I think has always been kind of underrated about Cypher, particularly again at higher levels, is the ult. Most people, I think, see Cypher's ult as kind of, you know, not that impactful, but at a high level, knowing exactly where all of your opponents are is round winning quite a lot of the time. And so it wouldn't shock me either if maybe the Cypher ult did become a 7-cost ult. And now let's talk about Gekko. And Gekko to me has one kind of key trait, key feature that I think needs to be changed. And most of you are probably already on the same wavelength, which is about the Wingman Plant and Diffuse. The thing is, a lot of people have suggested changing the Wingman Plant Diffuse to have Wingman has to do it for longer, right? Like it takes Wingman longer than it takes for a player. And that, I think, is a sensible solution, but I don't think is the greatest solution. Let me explain why. For me, the Wingman Plant isn't as big of a problem as the Wingman Diffuse is. The Wingman Diffuse is a really, really big problem in my opinion, because he kind of forces your opponent to do something that they otherwise would never do, right? For instance, if you're in a 1v1 and the diffuser doesn't know where the attacker is in this post plant, right? They have to check all these different angles. They might tap the spike to try and reveal or whatever, but you have a game of poker to then play, right? Of like, are they sticking it? Do I need to swing out at this moment, etc., right? I can hide my position still because I don't think that you are sticking it this time. But the problem is when Wingman's on the spike, you know that Wingman is sticking it. Like Wingman is definitely sticking it, so you have to reveal where you are. You have to kill Wingman off the spike because you know that he's sticking it no matter what. And that, I think, creates the main problem with this, is that it makes post plants so hard to win because you have to reveal where you are, right? And most of the time that's going to come whether it's utility or not. Yeah, there are some bits of utility, you know, like a Brim ult that, you know, you could do from a bunch of different positions potentially. But for most utility, they're going to see where that's coming from as well and be able to locate where you are. And even if you did extend how long it takes for Wingman to defuse the spike, whilst that would, you know, probably mean less overall Wingman diffuses, it would still create that problem of, well, Wingman is still sticking it, it might be slower, but you're still going to need to reveal where you are and kill that Wingman. And so for me, what I would probably prefer is, I don't really care too much if they don't change the Wingman Plant. If they do, fine, cool, that's fine as well. But I personally would hope to see that the Wingman Diffuse can only get to half, because then at least I don't have to always reveal where I am. I still probably want to kill that Wingman because them getting half is not great, but at least it's not like an absolute must. At least I still have kind of some poker cards to play. I can still do some things if I want to. And just quickly, one other thing that I know some people have brought up to me as well is about the Thrash when it comes to Gekko. Obviously, Gekko is often planting a lot in these rounds, so it's not uncommon in pro games to see Thrash online in round 3, maybe even round 2, to be honest, in a half. And so I know that a lot of people, you know, perhaps think that Thrash should be an 8-cost ult. I wouldn't be against that necessarily either, but I personally still think that Gekko is a fun agent overall and a good agent to see in pro play, and his pick rate isn't crazy high, so for now I would just like to see the Wingman kind of change, but if they did change the ult as well, I wouldn't be shocked.